Hi, this is Henry Mahncke from the Posit Science team, and today we're going to be talking about how we can use the basic science of brain plasticity to build brain training exercises to improve auditory processing. And we're also going to talk about the randomized controlled clinical trials that show that these exercises improve things like hearing and language processing. Now, auditory science has always been core to what we do here at Posit Science. And in fact, our co-founder, Dr. Michael Mahncke, was part of the team at the University of California, San Francisco that actually invented the cochlear implant, a device that cured deafness. And in fact, it was through those initial studies of the cochlear implant that Dr. Mahncke developed his ideas around brain plasticity. Today, we're using that science to build brain training exercises that can improve hearing in everyday situations, whether it's remembering what your spouse asked you to get at the store or hearing what your friends have to say in noisy restaurants. So let's dive in. Hearing is an incredibly important part of our life. Whether it's talking with our friends, keeping up with the news on radio or TV, remembering what our spouse wants us to pick up at the grocery store, or even just hearing the words that I'm saying right now on this webinar, being able to understand what people say, remember it, process it, and act on it is incredibly important for our lives. However, one important thing about hearing is that it changes with age. It's well known, of course, that as we get older, we typically have lower hearing sensitivity. We might say, I can't hear you in the next room. I need to be in the same room if we're going to talk. It's also well known that high-frequency hearing loss occurs. You might, for example, have a watch that has a high-pitched alarm that beeps on it and not notice it because your high-frequency hearing is not as good as it used to be. And as a result of that high-frequency hearing loss, certain parts of speech can be more difficult to distinguish. Sounds like f or th or s or z all have high-frequency components, and it can be hard to tell which one is which with older hearing. Associated with that, certain kinds of consonants become harder to distinguish. Sounds like ba, da, and ga can get garbled and confused as our ears get older and our hearing gets worse. As a consequence of those issues in speech reception, it becomes difficult to understand normal continuous speech. It's common, for example, for an older person to say, hey, I just can't understand the kids. They just talk too fast. I can't keep up. And related to that, hearing in noisy environments gets worse. We can hear people say, I just don't go to that restaurant anymore. It's just too noisy there and I can't hear my friends talk. These are all consequences of changes that occur both in the ear and in the brain. So let's dive into what's happening and talk about what we can do about it. Well, let's start with the ear, and in particular the cochlea. What we're looking at here is some beautiful scanning electron micrographs taken by researchers of the Karolinska Institute. And they're looking at the hair cells, which are the specialized cells that transduce vibrations in the air or sound into electrical or neural impulses that go to the brain. And when we look at a young rat in the top row, we see that these hair cells in the cochlea are laid out just beautifully. Wonderfully well-organized groups of these hair cells that can turn sound of any frequency into neural impulses. But as rats get older, and humans too, those hair cells start to be damaged, and as a result, they don't transduce sound as well anymore. And there's, of course, many reasons in a human's life that those might be damaged over time. Exposure to noise, let's say you have a job in the construction industry, or let's say you're a rock star like Pete Townsend. One way or the other, those cells can get damaged, and as a result, hearing can get worse. However, this kind of hair cell loss alone does not explain changes in higher auditory function, things like speech reception, memory, and cognition. If we're going to understand how those functions change, we have to go further up the system and take a look at auditory processing in the brain itself. So back to these rats, and experiments led by Etienne de Villers-Sidani when he was working at UCSF, he showed that there are dramatic changes in neural information processing in the auditory cortex of rats as they age. And again, on the top row here, we're looking at a young rat, and in the middle column, we're looking at processing speed. On the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis, we're looking at a series of different pulse trains, or series of clicks that are played to the young rat. And then each of those little black dots is a single neural spike that occurs in response to that. And when we see at the bottom row, when those clicks occur slowly at about 2.5 per second, each click, shown in red, is followed by a strong neural response, shown with black dots. And that continues. As those clicks get faster and faster, the neural response stays very tightly locked to the clicks all the way through. And it's only when the clicks get very fast, around 17 or 20 hertz, that response starts to break down in its accuracy. If we look at an older rat in the second row, we see that information processing has gotten messier. The older rat brain is not able to keep up with the speed of auditory inputs. When the clicks are slow, as shown on the bottom, we see a nice response to each click, but there's a lot of noise in the middle of those responses as well. And then as the clicks get faster, we see that the response of the brain just becomes murkier and noisier, and it doesn't exhibit the clean, fast response characteristics that a young rat's brain does. We can also look at this processing accuracy on the right-hand column. And what we're looking at now in this colorful picture, it's as if we're looking down on the surface of the rat auditory cortex. And each of these colored polygons represents a single recording from rat auditory cortex. And the color tells us how accurate the response is to sounds. And what colors like blue mean is that that part of the brain responds to only one frequency, which is to say it's highly accurate. The rat has a good chance of knowing what frequency is occurring in the outside world by the activity of this region of the auditory cortex. And you can see that in a young rat brain, most of it is blue and green. It's very accurate. However, in an older rat's brain, shown in the bottom row here, we see that much more of the brain is colored in orange and red. And these are regions that are not accurate, which is to say when they are active neurally, it doesn't give a lot of information around whether the rat is hearing a low tone, a high tone, or a medium tone. So together, these changes in neural speed and neural accuracy mean that the brain is noisier. The rat has a harder time decoding what's going on in the real world by simply looking at the neural activity in rat auditory cortex. Now, of course, this happens in humans as well, and as it happens in humans, this is what leads to speech reception problems. So we're looking at here on the left are spectrograms of normal speech, someone saying the word time or the word kind. And as you'll recall from earlier slides, that t and that k become hard to distinguish as our ears and our brains get older. And we might ask the question, well, why is that? And the answer is, well, it's actually a very hard problem. If you look at these spectrograms, where again time is shown on the x-axis, the y-axis is now frequency, and the intensity of the black coloring shows how much energy there is at that particular frequency at a particular point in time, you can see that the only difference really between the words time and kind occur in this initial segment here, which I've outlined in a red circle. And that happens over about 20 to 40 milliseconds. You can see that time has this downwards frequency modulated sweep, and kind has an upwards frequency modulated sweep. And that's really about the only difference between these. And in fact, that's characteristic of just about all of human speech. It requires a fast and accurate auditory processing system to decode it. And in fact, if a brain, for example, an older brain, has processing speeds slowing and accuracy challenges where it's not able to reliably detect or distinguish the difference between these two kinds of sweeps in the first 20 to 40 milliseconds, well, time and kind are going to get kind of muddled or garbled in the auditory cortex. And that's going to lead to a person not quite hearing what was said, struggling maybe to hear those words when they're said quickly or in a noisy environment, and in general, having a harder time operating on those words for cognitive function. We can see that illustrated very nicely here in experiments led by Bruce Schneider and his colleagues at the University of Toronto. And they started off on the left asking a simple question, which is, hey, do older listeners have a worse memory than younger listeners? And that's shown first here in absolute quiet. The younger listeners are shown in circles and the older listeners in squares. And unsurprisingly, in absolute quiet, when you read 10 words to a listener, the younger ones can remember more of them than the older ones do. Next, the researchers asked the question, well, what if we add external noise? What if we just read those 10 words in the background of some sort of static or some babble noise? And of course, what happens is both young listeners and old listeners get worse. Your memory is worse if you have to listen in a noisy environment. Where this gets extremely interesting and clever is shown here on the right. And what the investigators did here is they said, well, look, we know that older listeners are more sensitive to noise than younger listeners. So let's do this. Let's give the older listeners just a little bit of noise, and let's give the younger listeners a fair amount of noise. And in fact, let's give the younger listeners enough noise so that their hearing, as measured with an audiometer, is about equal to an older listener. And now let's see whose memory is better. And they see something absolutely fascinating, which is that when you add that extra noise to the younger listeners, you make their memory worse, exactly as if they were older listeners. And what's fantastically interesting about that is that tells us that perhaps a key contributor to the worse memory performance of older listeners is not just that their ears are worse or their cochlears are worse, but they're acting like they have an internal source of noise, which is contributing to their worse memory performance. And in that sense, they're looking exactly like those rats where we saw the worse speed and accuracy leading to worse neural performance. These older listeners are looking like that worse speed and accuracy, that internal noise, is potentially what's contributing at least somewhat to their memory challenges compared to younger listeners. Now, I want to step back just a moment and say, hey, these changes in hearing are incredibly important, not just for everyday communication or even cognition, but they're appropriate for brain health and long-term outcomes, including dementia. This is some beautiful work contributed to by Richard Google at the University of Utah. And what that team is looking at here is a classic Kaplan-Meier survival curve. On the x-axis here, we see years after the study starts. And on the y-axis is the fraction of people who do not have dementia. And they followed people for about 12 years and sorted them into people in green who had hearing loss at baseline and blue who had no hearing loss at baseline. And they saw something quite dramatic, which is that the folks who had hearing loss at baseline had a significantly higher risk of going on to dementia. You can see at just about every time point after 2.5 years, more people with hearing loss, again shown in green, have gone on to dementia compared to their compatriots, shown in blue, who did not have hearing loss. And when they did the math, they showed that hearing loss was associated with about a 27% increase in dementia risk. And what that meant is that folks who had hearing loss actually went on to dementia somewhat more than a year faster and earlier than folks who had no hearing loss. Put another way, good hearing is a protective factor against the onset of dementia. And you might ask, well, how could that be true? Changes in the cochlea really shouldn't be associated with dementia. But probably what's happening is that dementia risk is coming to some extent from indirect factors. As a person's hearing gets worse, they start to withdraw from social contact. They get less cognitive stimulation overall than they would have, and that may contribute to their dementia risk. And there are also direct factors. Essentially, that lower quality input to the central nervous system may unto itself start to cause the neural disorganization that's associated with dementia. But one way or the other, good hearing and good auditory information processing is crucial for good brain health. So what can we do about this? Well, let's turn to an animal model. So researchers at UCSF, including Etienne de Villers-Sidani, who we mentioned before, and Michael Mahncke, the co-founder of Posit Science, built a brain training program for rats to see if they can improve their hearing and improve their brain health. And the way this brain training program for rats worked is the rats heard a series of tones, like boop, 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 beep, boop, where one of them was different. And the rat learned very quickly that when she heard the one that was different, if she poked her nose in a certain corner of the cage, she would get a little rat treat. So, of course, rats love treats, and they'll work very hard for this. Now, because the researchers wanted to challenge the rat's brain, they made that task harder over time. For example, they might make it faster, like boop, 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 beep, boop, boop. And so the rat's brain had to process information faster to detect that oddball sound. They also might make the different sound more similar to the target sound. So it would go boop, 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 beep, boop, boop, boop. So the rat's brain had to be more accurate in order to detect that different sound. So if you train a rat to do this over the course of a month, you will get a rat who gets extremely good at this. Now let's see what happens to her brain. So back to these pictures, which as you will recall, show both the processing speed in the central column of the rat's brain and the processing accuracy shown in the colorful pictures on the right column. And as you recall, a young rat has very good processing speed. Her brain responds quickly and accurately to every click as clicks come faster and faster. And you'll recall that older rats start to exhibit worse processing speed. As those clicks come faster and faster, neural information processing is not able to keep up with that speed. Now, if we look at an old trained rat, we see something amazing, which is that the processing speed, the ability of the rat's brain to respond quickly after every single input that comes in, is almost fully restored to that of a young rat. You can see that even as these clicks get faster and faster, 10, 15, 20 times per second, the older rat brain is now keeping up in a way that the young rat used to do, but an untrained older rat brain does not do. On the right, we also see something remarkable, which is that the brain of this older rat, who's gone through this brain training program, shows much better processing accuracy. And in fact, virtually every region of her auditory cortex is now coded in blue or green, which means that it's responding quite tightly to, let's say, only low tones, or only high tones, or only medium tones, meaning that her brain accurately represents and encodes the information that's coming in from the outside world. So this is a pretty impressive demonstration of brain plasticity. By building this simple rat brain training program, these researchers were able to significantly improve processing speed and processing accuracy in the rat brain. But of course, we're not here to just help rats. We're here to see if we can help improve human performance. So what we've done at Posit Science is, inspired by that rat brain training program, we've now built human brain training programs, built on these principles of brain plasticity. So here's a very simple example, and if you've used the BrainHQ exercise sound sweeps, you'll know what I'm talking about. So in sound sweeps, you're going to hear two whistle sounds. The first one might go up, like, and the second one might go down, like. And your job is very simple, is to say, well, what did I hear first? In that case, an up sound, and what did I hear second? In that case, a down sound. And of course, because we want to challenge your brain, as you get those right, we can make them faster, like. And of course, if you get one wrong, we'll always back off and make it slower, like. Now, across many training sessions, we change the frequency of those sounds. We have low whistles, medium whistles, and high whistles. And we also change the sweep speed, so we'll have fast whistles and slow whistles. And all in all, what that does is it challenges the auditory cortex of a person to get faster and more accurate in exactly the same way that we did with the rat. Now, we didn't stop there. We actually built a set of auditory training exercises, which were all designed to work together. Now, each of them is based on the idea of improving speed and accuracy, but they do it in different ways, and the ways in which they do it are designed to fully span all of the types of sound and auditory processing that are required for speech reception. There are exercises that focus on very simple auditory features like those sweeps. Exercises that focus on consonants, on syllables, on whole words, on sentences. And then these exercises are extended to engage memory load and in some cases social cognition load, and to require a person to both enhance and to suppress their overall attention. One way or the other, we are trying to improve all of these aspects of auditory reception to make a better speech processor in the brain. So, what happens when a person does this training? Well, we're very fortunate that researchers at Northwestern University, Samira Anderson and Nina Kraus, have taken a careful look at this in two different randomized controlled studies. Now, both these studies had a very similar flow, shown here on the left. Older adults were recruited into the study, given a baseline assessment of hearing and cognitive function, and then randomized either into a group that did cognitive training, those auditory BrainHQ exercises, or did an active control, and in this case they watched and learned from educational DVDs. And then afterwards, both groups went through a post-training assessment to see what had changed. And there were two studies that I'll talk about. In the first study, there were 67 participants who had normal hearing, and in the second study, they looked at 28 participants with normal hearing and 30 who had specific hearing loss. In both cases, the groups did 8 weeks of auditory-focused cognitive training, and they actually did the cognitive training on their own at home for about 40 hours total. Cognitive function was assessed with a speech and noise test, short-term memory test, processing speed test, and attention tests, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then they also measured the electrophysiological response of the brain to sounds with brainstem EEG. So what did they see? Well, let's look first at study number 1, which was conducted in older adults with normal hearing. And let's start on the left to look at the behavioral changes. And what we're looking at in these figures is people who went through the auditory training, shown in red, people who are in the active control group, shown in blue. And on the left of each pair is the function before training, and on the right is the function after training. In the first measure, we're looking at speech and noise reception with the quicksand test. Essentially, a person hears words presented in louder and louder amounts of noise and has to identify what word they've heard. And in this case, lower scores are better, and what we see is this beautiful improvement, this lowering of the speech and noise threshold for folks who went through the auditory training. We see some improvement in the active control, but it's quite clearly less. And when the researchers did the statistics, they saw a very significant group by time interaction, which is to say the improvement in speech and noise reception in the auditory trained group was much larger than it was in the active control group. They showed the same thing in working memory here using the Woodcock-Johnson test. In this case, higher scores are better. We're looking at index scores, so an average person would get about 100. And we see that there's nice improvement here in the auditory training group and really no change in the control group at all. Again, highly statistically significant, favoring the trained group. And they also looked at a processing speed measure from the Woodcock-Johnson 3, and again showed a nice improvement in the auditory trained group and really no change in the active control group. Again, highly significant. So behaviorally, we see that older adults who go through the auditory training exercises improve their speech reception, their memory, and their processing speed. But what's happening neurologically? So on the right, what we're looking at is changes in the brainstem EEG response. And what the researchers did is they played a phoneme, a sound like a da, and then with brainstem EEG took a look at the electrical encoding of that da. In the top graph, we're looking at people who hear that da sound in the quiet. And in the first phase, called the transition, that's the da part of the da. And in a steady state, this is the ah part of the da. In blue, we're looking at the active control, and what we're looking at here is the difference. How much faster is that response after training than before? And of course, the active control is essentially centered around 0, as you might expect. The response to the brainstem to the sound is not any faster after training than it was before. But in the auditory training group, in the first part of that sound, where that da sound is being made, we see that the response in the brainstem is significantly faster after training than it was before. And that means that neural information processing has been sped up by this auditory training. At the bottom, we see that this result is even more dramatic and significant when that da sound is presented in noise. We now see that the improvement in that neural speed is even more dramatic in the initial phase. We can now actually see it throughout the vowel portion of that consonant as well. So what that tells us is that this auditory training has improved not only the cognitive performance of the people who did it, but has actually quite literally changed their brain performance as well. Now in the next study, these researchers asked, well, is this true for people who have hearing impairment as well? So again, this was done in 28 older adults with hearing impairment. We're looking at the same kind of graphs here on the left. The first one here is our Quicksand results, looking at speech and noise. Again, beautiful improvement in the trained group. In this case, essentially no improvement in the active control. When we look at short-term memory, again, we see this nice improvement in the trained group, really no change in the active control. And the same pattern of results. In this case, they use an attention test instead of a processing speed test. This is a cross-modal continuous performance test. But again, beautiful improvement in the trained group and really no change in the control group. I should say that this is a smaller study, only 28 people, so that the statistics we're now looking at are within group improvements in each group as opposed to across group improvements. But still, very nice behavior results and very consistent with the larger study done in people with normal hearing. Okay, so how about that brainstem EEG response? Well, we're now going to look at the data a little bit differently, starting with the active control group, here shown in blue. The x-axis here is a measure of frequency, and the F0, H2, and so forth refers to the specific frequency bands that are produced in human speech, in this case the da. The y-axis shows the amplitude of the neural response to those frequencies. And what we see is that when you make a da sound and record in the brainstem EEG, you see that the response is focused on these certain energy bands, as you'd expect. And what we also see is that there's really no change as a result of the active control training. The pre-training data shown in the dashed line very much overlaps with the post-training data shown in the solid line. Now, if we look at the group that did auditory training, we see a very different picture. We see that there's this nice narrowing of the response as we go from pre-training to post-training. And what that means is that the brainstem EEG responses become more accurate. The energy is now focused more precisely on the areas where that sound is actually occurring in the da sound. And so what that means is the auditory training has not only improved behavior, as we've seen here on the left, speech and noise, memory, and attention measures, but it's also changed the accuracy of neural information processing as early as the brainstem. So to summarize these two studies, what researchers showed is that the plasticity-based auditory cognitive training exercises in BrainHQ improve speech reception, as measured with the standard hearing and noise test, improves cognitive performance as measured with standard processing speed, attention, and memory tasks, and improves neural timing and neural accuracy as measured with brainstem EEG. And one thing I should further note is that these effects are actually larger in populations who have worse hearing at baseline. So let's step back. What does this all mean? Well, good hearing in both the ear and in the brain is absolutely essential for brain health, and it's absolutely essential for a happy life. We know that poor hearing is a key cause of cognitive decline, a key cause of social isolation, loss of independence, and even dementia, as we saw. Now, we can already address the root causes of peripheral hearing dysfunction with hearing aids. That's a well-worked-out science and a well-worked-out distribution system. But what we're seeing now is that we can address the root causes of central hearing dysfunction with cognitive training. And together, these technologies can significantly improve life for older adults. Okay, if you'd like to learn more about these exercises, head on over to www.brainhq.com. You can register for free and try out a number of these auditory exercises to see what they're like. With that, thanks for listening today, and happy brain training.